Hello, everyone. Welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Robert Jackson Bennett to celebrate the launch of Locklands. My name is Bonnie, and I'm a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. If you're familiar with our store, I saw some Brookliners in the chat. Welcome back. And if this is the first time you're hearing about us, looking at you, Arizona, we are very happy to have you. Thank you for joining our community this evening. We appreciate your support of Robert's work and an independent bookstore through your purchases and attendance. To introduce tonight's author, Robert Jackson Bennett was born in Louisiana, but grew up in Texas. He is the author of American Elsewhere, The Truth, The Company Man, and Mr. Shivers, as well as the Hugo Award-nominated Divine Cities Trilogy and the Founders Trilogy. His work has received the Edgar Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the Philip K. Dick Citation of Excellence, and he has been shortlisted for the World Fantasy, British Fantasy, and Locus Awards. He attended the University of Texas, Austin, and now lives in Austin with his family. His latest novel, Locklands, is the incredible conclusion to the Founders Trilogy. In the book, Sanchia, Clef, and Berenice have gone up against long odds in the past, but the war that they're fighting now is one that even they can't win. This time, they're not facing the robber baron elites or even an immortal Hierophant, but an entity whose intelligence is spread over half the globe, one that uses the magic of scribing to control not just objects, but human minds. We see these characters who we've watched grow and change over the course of the series face their greatest foe yet. They have to use all their cunning, strength, and audacity to fight, and they have to make great sacrifices to try and win. In a starred review, Kirkus called it great fun with nonstop action and characteristically high-spirited mayhem. It is a conclusion that provides great insight into the mythology of the incredible world that Robert has built, and it gives lush backstories to some of the characters that we've come to know. We're so excited to have Robert here to talk about it. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Robert Jackson Bennett. Make some noise in the chat. But hello, congratulations, it's launch day, no?
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah, you've made it. You've made it here. Very good. Oh, we've got some lovely welcoming in the chat going on for you. So first off, we wanted to open up with, if there's anyone who's in the Zoom right now who's maybe not familiar with the series, do you want to kind of give us an elevator pitch of books 1 through 3 without too many, spoilers for the plot purists out there?
Sure. So the Founders Trilogy is set in a world that feels a little bit like Venice in like the 1400s, maybe 1500s, or in the start of the Italian Wars. And it is about a city called Tavan, which is dominated by 4 merchant houses who have perfected a magic called scribing. Scribing is the act of writing instructions, pretty much, on an object to convince it to do something that it normally would want to do. For example, say for an arrow, you would write instructions on it that says to it that when you fly out of the bolt caster of this crossbow, you are not flying forward, but you're in fact falling down. And you've actually been falling down for a very long time, straight down toward the earth. That means that when it goes out, it's going to go out super fast, and it's also not going to arc or drop. It'll be like a laser beam. And like you can also like write instructions on it that says that the tip is very sharp, or that it will actually catch fire and burn on impact. And like in a way, it functions a lot like coding. This is extremely hard to do. You have to be extremely smart. It takes a lot of like resources, which means that it is a magic that is only practiced by the elite who have used this magic to build foundries, to make these scribed objects called rigs on a huge scale. Scribed ships, scribed weapons, scribed armies, scribed buildings, scribed armor, all kinds of stuff. And they've used that to capture a huge amount of control of the known world. So there's 4 houses. They're not friends, but they reluctantly all get along. Like in the midst comes Sancho Grado, who is a scribed person. It's very hard to describe a person because a person has their own intelligence. But she actually is scribed. She has a plate in her full of commands that allow her to touch an object and to like understand its nature. Like if she holds a box in her hands, the box will tell her what's inside of it. If she can touch a lock, then the lock like will tell her how to pick it. So she's an extremely good thief, but this means that she can't touch that many things, or else her brain gets overwhelmed. She's sent on a job to rob something from one of the merchant houses. It turns out to be a key, a scribe key. But when she picks the key up, she finds out that it talks. It talks inside of her mind. The key has its own intelligence in it. It is the most advanced scribed item in the world. And now that she's stolen it, some very powerful people are about to come after her. That's pretty much the pitch. I had to think real hard because it's been a couple of years since I had to pitch this sucker. It's like 2015, 2016. So I think I got like 80% of that, maybe.
Yeah, that sounded good. That sounded like certainly a perfect introduction in case there are folks who haven't read the books, although I'm willing to bet that a lot of our audience tonight are big fans. Which of course brings the question, how does it feel to have finished this, very beloved trilogy? You've come to the end.
It feels super weird to finish a trilogy or to finish a series in general. Mm-hmm. It feels a little bit like you are locking up on a house that you lived in for a very long time. You've moved all the stuff out. You're about to go somewhere new, and there's lots of memories of the things that you did in that old house, but you also have to acknowledge that you're done. And also, part of living in a house, it's a house that you love, but also there's crap that you start to sort of like hate that like bothers you. You're like, man, I could never, that faucet never worked right. And this garage, I thought it had space, but it didn't. And then the attic, like it seems so cool to have an attic, but actually I see my mom's attic and it is way bigger. Like this attic is actually tiny. So it's got those sort of weird things where like, this is where I grew into be this person, but then you are looking at a new house that you're about to move into. You're like, man, I cannot wait to try out some new stuff over here and also make a mess of that place. That's kind of how it feels.
Yeah, I love that metaphor of the house, especially because, it sounds like since you finished a series before, like the Divine Cities, like, would you say that it was a similar experience when you finished that, but just a different house, kind of? Yeah.
Nice. I did. And I wrote my first draft of Foundry side because it was just so nice to do a change of pace. And this happens every single time that I get done with the series, where I start a new project and I'm just so excited to write it. I write a lot and not thoughtfully, which usually means that to throw the whole damn thing away and be like, okay, well, now what the hell am I actually doing here? But yeah, the same thing happened at the end of the Divine Cities, where I got so excited to write Foundry side that I wrote like 50,000 words before I was like, wait a minute, let's think about this, and pulled it all back and started to put the pieces together.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot of words to pull back. It sounds like, so you go into the series and you have this kind of new, this new excitement and this sort of like, I don't know, call it new house feeling. How does that feeling or process kind of like change over the course of writing this series? Once I imagine that like any house purchase, any new car, that feeling goes away. You start to see that, like you said, the leaky faucet, the tiny attic. So how does that sort of develop as you continue the series?
Well, for this, it's tricky because with books, the purpose of writing books is sort of to ask questions that you find are interesting. And when you're writing a series, you kind of have to plot it out carefully to make sure that the questions that you ask yourself in each book are still pretty interesting. In Foundry side, I think it was a critique of power and how like industrialization sort of like asks us to be things. We are cogs in a larger machine. And then in Shorefall came along, and when I was starting to write Shorefall, I kind of wanted to keep it in that same vein of something that was, a light, fun critique of like industrialization, technology, Silicon Valley. But then, like, as I wrote it, I sort of realized, I know how I feel about all this stuff. Like if the question is like, do I think that like really big, horrible tech companies are good? Like that's not interesting. I know how I feel about that. A good comparison for this, there's the show Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which is about Satanism and about wondering if you want to be a part of Satanism. And Satanism in the show feels a lot like the Catholic Church, like highly patriarchal, very top down. And it's like, is this good? Should she want to do this? And I'm like, from the first episode, I'm like, no. I mean, this going to be interesting to watch this? And so, like, I was trying to write Shortfall, and I was like, I feel like I have a lot of like, I'm not asking questions that I find too interesting. So I really had to back off and rethink and ask myself, what is the position that I want to be in, where this is going to lead to some place that I find has nuance or vagueness or like ambiguities to it. And that led to me really bringing Crucides on a lot earlier, because I think a lot of fans out there would have preferred that I stick to a story of like revolution and fun and chaos, because we have it in our brains that those things are fun. A lot of like reason for that is that a lot of my readers are from like America, where we're like revolutions are good because they're successful and lead to good things. This is not true, however. Most revolutions are terrible and usually lead to pretty bad things and fail. And so I realized that I wanted to have a character come in and voice that aspect of saying like, hey, I've done this before. It's not going to go, you think? And once I realized that that was how the book should go, the whole thing changed immensely, the entire shape of the book. So that's kind of the tricky thing with these things, is that like, personally for me, it's not just like, here's one long story. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to go here. And then I'm going to go here. It's just chopping it up, because I don't think that's a satisfying read. Things just kind of stop. And I've read books like that, where it's like the first of a series. I'm like, this book just stops. Like, it's not satisfying, like at all. Like each book is not a satisfying installment. It is just a piece of this larger thing. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. So the question really became like trying to like position each book around the questions that I found most like fascinating to ask about technology, about progress, about how society progresses, stuff like that, real big stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually kind of leads me into a question I had, because like the texture of the books is a little different from book to book. And obviously you have the time jump that mean, the characters are different because time has passed and the world's a little different. But it sounds like, so you kind of go in with maybe some plot ideas in mind and then delve into like the thematic content, or is it the other way around where you're like, no, the theme comes before the plot point?
Usually like what I do is I start trying to, like, I kind of start with a plot and see if it excites me or if I find it fascinating. And if so, then I start wondering, why do I find this interesting? Because like for like Shorefall, the whole plot of like the first like Shorefall was they're going to have a magic startup and they're going to have to go to war with all like the big houses. But that wasn't interesting because I was like, I know how I feel about the big houses. I know how my readers feel about the big houses. Like we saw the Foundry side, there's no good ones. Like there's no like ambiguity. So I started with that plot and I said, no, that's not how this should be. So like really like I guess it's a mixture of both. It's not a satisfying answer. A lot of it is like testing and feeling your way through stuff. It's like and I find that this is true for most books. Every time you write a new book, like the pattern that you had in your brain for the old one, it doesn't work. And that's good, because if the pattern does work, then you're basically just doing the same thing before, which is not satisfying to write. It might be satisfying to read. There are times where I want a book or a show, and it's like, you walk up to like the soda fountain, and if I put it like into that drink, I want that drink to come out. I don't want it to be a new experiment. But that wasn't kind of the thing that I was going to be doing here. So I really had to experiment and play around to make sure that the characters were breathing and changing. And that's a big thing that I do in a lot of my series. Like in like the Divine Cities, I think it goes that there's 3 or 4 years in between Stairs and Blades, and then I think it's like 18 years from Blades to Miracles, something like that. It's like more than a decade. And I think that that just makes it a lot more interesting because it gives the characters a chance to change a little bit and the world to change a little bit. So then when you come into it, because a lot of the fun things about like fantasy is your chance to explore the new, the unfamiliar. It's like an escape. And that's what's always fun about the first like installment of a story is you're like, oh, this is new. I get to go around, I get to find out this new stuff about the library. And that's, I think, why school stories work so well, because each grade that you go up, a new part of the school unlocks. You're going into a new space. And so I like, and because I find that I write a lot about time and about progress and about how people change, that requires a time jump of some sort. So that's why I usually find myself sticking at those.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you choose your time jump, is it because you sort of know where you want your characters to be and you're like, I think after 2 years, this character will be here and then we have a new story? Or is it more like you pick the time jump and then find out who your characters are as you write?
No, I definitely need to figure out, like, there's a place that I need them to get to. And I have to think about the amount of time that it would take for them to get there. Like, for example, how long would it take for the city of Devon to change a significant amount, but not so much that people can't recognize it anymore? Like 1 year is not enough. Like the whole city changing in a year, that's not enough. 2 years is implausible, is improbable, but plausible. So that was with Shorefall, where I was like, I need to have things coalesce. I need to have like these dynamic shifts some. And then from the shift from Shorefall to Locklands, it's like about an open war that has changed the entire world, that has eaten like the whole world. And more importantly, like Sancha and her crew have made like a new way of life. They have been on the run, but in like being on the run, they've made a new way of living, of being a human society. And I was like, what is a plausible amount of time for someone to build that? Like, is it 4 years? I was like, 4 years is not really enough time for someone to do that. 6 years, maybe. 10 years is too much. Like 10 years, I think people will shut down. They'll be like, a decade? God. And so I thought 8 years feels long, but like not too long. It's a real guessing game thing. It's like, like sales at Target. They're always $9.99. So it's a lot about how the numbers taste. But yeah, I definitely am trying to think of a position for them to get to get into, and also to have them change the amount that I need to. Like Locklands is about these people growing into themselves and being adults. I think like Foundry side, they're young. In Shorefall, they are on the cusp of being, you're like 26 to 28. It's capable of having children, owning a house, and doing stuff. And then in this one, they're in their like late 30s. They are mid to late 30s. They are adults who I think have a better comprehension of time. And I think that that's the critical thing. Like when you are a kid, a summer is forever. And when you are in your 20s, a year feels long, but not too long. And then when you get to be about my age, when you're 40, you start planning not in months, but in years, like in 2 to 3 years, we'll be able to get here. And that seems like a digestible amount of time. And I think that really seeing them change as people and grow into a sense of like maturity, it really does need time. They need to sort of see the way that time bends around them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because the way that you describe sort of how you lead your characters in part kind of reminds me of scribing itself, because scribing is this sort of like reality bending magic, right? And I was just curious. I think like as humans, we have a natural tendency to both have things happen to us and also impose things on the world around us. And that's kind of like what scribing is to me. And it sounds like too, almost like it parallels the writing process where you are both scribing and being scribed upon by like what your characters tell you almost? Is this metaphoric? I feel like, I wonder if you think of the creative process in that sort of way, or if you have like a different outlook. Like, is your creative process sort of this reality bending thing, or something that moves your reality?
Well,
or is it something else?
Well, the Greek word for character, if I recall, is that which is engraved. So when you think of character as in both in a story as in yourself, and like, I don't know when this transition happened, because in Greek, I'm sure it meant like a letter, but at some point in time it shifted to also being something larger, like the idea of like an identity. But I like to think that like engraving process still transitions with that. And so I think with like characters in a story, I'm both like making them, I am like engraving them, in words on the text, and also like in your brain, of course. Like the question, there was a question once in a book that I read a long time ago about like if character is that which is engraved, who is doing the engraving? So is the world like engraving upon you, or do you engrave upon yourself? And I think that kind of works alongside scribing, and that scribing is a series of characters that basically convince someone to do something, or to convince an object to do something that it normally wouldn't. But like, yeah, the way I think about books is highly mechanical, which I think also aligns itself well with coding. And in that, like, I find it's a lot about balance and about components and like toolboxes and things like that, crap plugging into other crap. And there's times where, and like the whole thing, like, to me is like a model that they run, like, like for physics or like economics, like where like if we change this value, what happens? So a lot of it for me is like trying to figure out how I feel about things. It is a simulation of reality. Our world changed very slightly to like alter the levels of pressures, of gravity, things like that, to see what happens if I do this. And you got to get all your components and all of your flow throughs built correctly to make sure that the model like expresses itself in a way that grants clarity. That's tricky, but but like that's a big part of writing, is that like I go along and I realize something's missing here. There is a transition moment. There's a balance point. This needs to be like inserted like upstream in the text to make sure that when this moment lands, it actually has impact and stays like anchored in the reader's mind. All kinds of crap like that. So this is like the sort of like boring crap that I think people don't like listening to about fiction, but it is the stuff that gets me high.
Nice. I mean, I think I would challenge that. I think a lot more people are interested in that than at least, maybe I'm just centering my own feelings, but I find it very interesting as well. Speaking of sort of like the ways in which scribing like works in this world, it has a lot of influences, and I like your reference to the Greek meaning of character, or the Greek origin of character as in to engrave upon. So it makes me think of like this sort of like historical influence, not only on like the process of scribing itself, and of course the coding influence that you mentioned, but also just the historical and technological influences that we see in the book overall. And I was just curious, you have a lot of knowledge on like these historical things, on coding. Is this something that knowledge that you previously had and inspired the book, or is it something that you kind of uncovered while researching for the book?
A lot of it is just stuff that I was consuming at the time, kind of flowing into what I was writing. And I feel like reading history and a lot of like nonfiction stuff and the coding and whatever is a lot like research for a book, where the real danger is you can get yourself in a place where like you're like, I did a shitload of research trying to figure out how these people made ballots back in the 14th century to vote on their city councilors. I am owed the chance to keep this whole plot component in the story, even though I know it fucking sucks. And so that's the really tricky part, because when I wrote Shorefall, I was going to like have a piece of it feel like the Haitian like revolution, which is the only successful slave like rebellion in Western history, if I recall. And then I was like, and I was quickly like, you know what, this is really not what this is about. This is like, you know, this would be fun to include, but that is not what's happening here. For Foundry side, you know, I like actually like folks talk a lot about like Venice, and people also compare a lot to capitalism, which I think has become a stand-in for thing I don't like and can't control. But what I based it actually on a lot was Rome, because Rome, you know, like for centuries was like a republic where the soldiers served in seasons and then went home to farm. And what happened was it got so big that at some point in time, they started to pay the soldiers to serve year round, and they could not go back to their farms to farm. So they just had to leave their farms behind. While like the soldiers were like fighting all these wars, they took all the populations as captives, made them slaves. So what happened was the rich people were able to buy the slaves and bring them home to these farms that no one was working, and have them work the farms, and that made them incredibly wealthy very, very quickly. And that led to a huge imbalance where at some point in time they ran out of like places to conquer. So you had these huge families, houses, whatever, all in this like city, basically trying to figure out how to duke it out. And that was kind of the path that like Tavon was always meant to go along. And there were a few people who like in reviews were like, there's no way this is stable. I'm like, no, it's not stable. It was really fun to have to drop someone like into the story who is like, I've done this before, I've seen this before, I know how this is going to go, and to have them be inside of the story trying to take it over from the inside. That was a tremendous amount of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. What you were talking about earlier too, it reminds me of like when you're writing even like because these books aren't historical fiction, but historical fiction has to sort of move toward an inevitability like you're describing. And the fun of it is discovering the characters and the situations that are unfolding in sort of like, it's like the minutia of this grand arc, which I think is really, really exciting and interesting. And personal too, I think, because we have to really put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is in a revolution. Like you were saying earlier, it's easy for us to have these grand ideas about revolution, and we want the inevitable conclusion of a revolution to be like the good guys win, right? But like to actually be in that situation, it's very, very different. I was curious too, so with the sort of historical influences, of course, you also have a very cyberpunk vibe in these stories. They almost feel like combination cyberpunk heist kind of like stories, which are genres that we're familiar with, but then there's this rich fantasy world around them that's really wonderful. And I was just curious, like, do you have cyberpunk influences or things that you sort of looked to when you were incorporating that in your world?
Yeah, totally. Like when I was, and they really come more into effect in Locklands, but when I first pitched the whole series, I was like, it's like a cyberpunk fantasy. It's like an augmented thief who is fighting these giant corporations who use this high-tech stuff. And everyone, but it's fantasy. There's beards and swords and magic. And that was how I got a lot of people like, yeah, cool, sold. Because this has like known beats to it. And there's like the fun kind of cyberpunk, which is light and not terribly thoughtful. which is, just that kind of stuff. It's about like the aesthetics, about the punk vibe. But what is I find better is when it gets more reflective. And I mentioned this in a recent interview, but Blade Runner, it's a great mood piece of a movie. I'm not going to say it's a great movie. I rewatched recently and I was like, wow, there's not as much plot here as I remember. But it has a really great sense of mood to it. And I think that there's lots of great cyberpunk out there, like The Ghost in the Shell and things like that, that are about what it's like when our identity like merges with technology or can be changed by technology. And that it's kind of like melancholy and sweet. And there's a sense of transition, that we are leaving something behind, and maybe for the better. And I think a lot of that is that cyberpunk, there's the idea of technology changing very, very quickly, where normally we are like, things change slow enough that we don't get to notice the change or mark it. But with cyberpunk, we can see it happening before our eyes. It's kind of tricky because there's a grand idea of cyberpunk, which is that so like basically from like the 1880s to like the 1940s, productivity was like just kept going up. We kept like making like new machines that could do new stuff. And like the idea was that if you fall asleep like in New York City in like 1890 or like 1870, and then you woke up in like 1930, you'd be like, holy shit, everything's changed, nothing's recognizable. But then if you fell asleep in like 1830 and woke up in like 1960, like, yeah, still the same. And then like maybe even like 1980, like 1990, where basically we ran out of like ways to do more stuff. And one of the things that aligns with that era of high productivity is optimistic science fiction, the idea of spaceships, going off planet, like the gosh, wow, super cool science fiction. And then right around the 1970s, which is when the productivity stuff really bottomed out, you have inflection point, which is where we start to put more of like economic efforts towards finance, Wall Street, debt, things like that. That's where our big brains are going, are towards that. That's also when we start to computers, because it's a lot easier actually to make computers than it is to make a building. Or factories. And that's also when cyberpunk changed. That's when we or started. Like up until about like the late 60s, mid 70s, we had optimistic science fiction, and then things changed where the idea of technology became threatening, where the idea that like your institutions are out to help you change too. And the idea that your like identity could survive in this world became a question. And I think that that's a really quite interesting pivot. And when I wrote this series, I was kind of thinking about the next pivot, because this is a world in which, like, they, like, if it were the real world, they would have extremely high productivity. They could do all kinds of crazy shit. But the problem is that it's captured by only a handful of people. So it's not actually being put to its best uses. You are not like, because like a few people control the good stuff, then it's not actually being used by the most people. It's like, how in like Kentucky, which has a huge amount of coal, a lot of resources, Kentucky is not the most advanced place to live. Same thing for like Saudi Arabia or places like that. Because you have a great resource, you are then cursed to likely let the few control it. And so I really wanted to think about like that next pivot where this gets possessed by a huge amount of people. What are they going to do about it? What does it take to get them there? And then what do they become? That's a very long answer, but
no, but it's a very good answer, I think. Like, it's sort of delving into that progress. And again, it's like, it's that hurtling toward an inevitability, but a different inevitability than revolution, maybe just the inevitability of progress and change, and then diving and dissecting like the very minutia of it. And that's where kind of the meat of the story is, which is really exciting, I think. So as far as, I want to backtrack a little, because I've been thinking about this. you mentioned a very specific, like 1400s ballot casting research, like these very specific details. And it made me think of Ursula Le Guin. Have you read The Dispossessed?
Not The Dispossessed, I don't think.
So she was asked in an interview, like, were there things about the world that like didn't make it into the book? And her answer was that on Anaris, which is like the sort of moon that this sort of utopian society exists on, she was like, there are pickle barrels on all the street corners, but I just couldn't find like a good way to like put it into the book. It just wasn't fitting. I really, really wanted it in there. Like it's very real. But I couldn't fit it in the plot in a way that like made sense. So I had to cut it, but I want the readers to know that the pickle barrels are there. And I was wondering if you had anything like that in the world, because it sounds like you've had to kill your darlings a little bit as far as what does and doesn't fit into the world. Do you have a pickle barrel of sorts?
Kind of. And this like
really turned into something larger in Locklands. This was something that, like, when I first brought up the idea of doing it in Shorefall, like my editor was like, this is a world breaker. You cannot do this. And I was like, yeah, good point. Or it was the idea of like a tank that can hold its own lexicon, and basically would mean that you don't have to have like an army anymore. This thing could, because it has its own lexicon and can carry it around with it, that can like reinforce the commands that are flowing through its armor and its weaponry, then this is a powerful tool of invasion. But it was way too advanced to drop into Foundry's head at the very start. So instead I built that plot around the gravity rigs, but that became sort of the dead lamps in Locklands, which is a very different sort of world breaking device. I mean, it literally breaks the world. But so there was that one, and like, I don't know, I had so many drafts of these where I would have a really cool idea and then junk it because it just really wasn't kind of doing what I needed it to do. I don't know, like for like writing these has been interesting because I had to key, like I would have a plot sequence occur with a scribed trick, like a fun little scribe hack. And like my editor would send me a note saying, I need you to do this, but it needs to be a little bit more ingenious and delightful. Can you make it a little bit more ingenious and delightful? And I was like, I know. You want me to find like an ingenious and delightful way to make 14 people explode? And he would be like, yes. And so it was one of those like odd little things where like I'm trying to mimic something in my brain. Like that's how I have a picture of what this looks like. But then when you say something like this needs to be more delightful, I'm like, I have no fucking idea what delightful looks like. And it's not like I have a bucket of delight and I could just dump it on this thing. So I frequently would have to invent these rigs and tools and tricks and be like, this isn't delightful enough, and like throw it away. As well as sometimes it felt like a cheap hack. Well, like I was like, I'm literally hacking the story, and I like in a way that's not fun, where someone's gonna be like, "This, I could see you just cutting through plot." So I had to junk a lot of those. There is a huge amount of junk stuff here. I have probably junked for good reason. So there's probably someone out there who would love to see it. I'm like, I don't think you actually do. It's just gonna be mildly embarrassing.
It could maybe interesting in like 30 years when you don't have to, that was 30 years ago. You don't have to fully take responsibility because that was past you. I think, I mean, speaking of things that fans sort of might want or like, I know, am I correct in I think I read that you kind of came up in like the fan forum era when you started reading and engaging with science fiction and fantasy. I was curious, have you been on any fan forums of your own work, and have you seen? You haven't. So do you know of any like? I mean, I'm sure they I'm not really a.
Do they exist? Do you know if they exist?
They must. I am not a forum person myself. That kind of engaging with things I love on the internet intimidates me. So I kind of avoid that. But I feel like there must be just some like absolutely wild fan theories and conversations that were going on. And I was curious if you had seen any, but
No, I try
like it, once you get to a certain stage in your like writing career, you stop even looking at like the Amazon pages or the Goodreads pages, and it requires someone else to say, hey, you got a problem here, buddy. Or hey, think like congrats on that thing. And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So yeah, I have not gone out and tried to look for slash fic of my characters yet.
Yet. Maybe give it.
What'll be really funny, and like I see this in lots of reviews, is seeing that people get all the spellings like crazy wrong. And like I feel like some of them are like normal words, like Valeria, and the one that's really popular is they call it Travon, like Trevanne. And it's just kind of funny seeing people feel that this word should be something else. Like I'm not mad. I'm like, maybe you should have called it Travon.
Maybe that would have been, I don't think it would have made the book any better, but it would have made it.
They're like right next to each other on the keyboard.
Yeah, easier to spell, you know?
Yeah.
Well, speaking of sort of fans and series and questions, we do have a nice sort of set of audience questions. So I'd love to dive into those. So we have someone who asked, as an author, after a writing session, does it take time to adjust or return to adjust to your return to reality? Or do you sort of have moments of like post-book hangover?
Post-book hangover
Is a thing. But adjusting to reality from a single like writing session, not really. And that's just because like I'm busy. And like, I think I've always been a little bit of a freak where like I can just kind of stop when I have to, like the harder thing is sitting back down to get into the groove where I have to read the previous scenes to sort of feel the cadence of the story. And the harder thing there is I'm like, this scene actually sucks. I wrote this yesterday and I don't like it. Then I have to fix that. And then I'm like, now I get to go to the next thing. And then I run out of time. Then I have to do the next thing tomorrow. But a book hangover is a very much real thing because like when I'm writing a story, like it occupies a percent of my brain, like bandwidth or like disk space at all times. Like if I'm like switching laundry or cooking or something like that, or listening to music, in the back of my head, I am experiencing this moment of some of the characters, thinking about what should really happen here. I think Stephen King called it the boys in the basement, who are just like always like working on what you're doing. And so when you fix it and move on, and like you don't have a new thing lined up, that can be a hangover. The real hangover is once it's done, it stops being a fun project and starts being a thing you have to send to your editor. It stops being like a hobby, and then it transitions to a personal, like a professional, like liability, an obligation, like a legal, like part of a legal contract. That is an interesting transition.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a little bit of a drag, going from like all sorts of discovery and creativity into like, we are fulfilling the contract now.
Yeah. I'm
gonna get comments on this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like there can be sort of joy in the editing process, but
yeah,
with that joy comes maybe some dread.
There's a gap usually between the first drafting and the first comments back. Usually I find comments very helpful. They give me ideas on how to like, like there was something wrong here, but I didn't know what, and now I know what. And like, that is like, I think like one of the things that I like, I'm not going to say that I'm the greatest writer in the world, but I'm like, that's what I'm good at. That's like, I'm a professional like baseball player, and the thing I do is bunt. I'm not good at anything else, but I can bunt. That is the thing that I feel like I'm pretty good at, is like in the moment, be like, yeah, I'll just junk that bit and do this thing instead. The thing that was really tricky with these books is that all the parts touch. The world is so complex, and the machine, like all the actual like machinery is so complex that trying to junk stuff was actually pretty tricky. But But yeah, like I do find comment section pretty helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads into a nice, it's a nice sort of segue into another audience question, which Elise asks, what's your best method of getting through writer's block?
Usually,
Like writer's block is I find a problem of not knowing what question you're trying to answer on the page. Like when the words are really going really good is because you are doing something new or being drawn towards a moment that you find alluring, compelling, fascinating. And if you have writer's block, that means that you have not really figured out how to position stuff in a way that directs your attention as a reader and the writer. So usually I find that you have to mess around to reimagine. And also like it helps to like as an exercise in your brain, like switch up what kind of story this is. Like if this was a spy story, what would happen next? If this was a noir story, what would happen next? This is a romance or a historical saga, what would happen next? And that can sort of bring about the like a greater conception of what kind of story you are currently writing. And like I had this just recently where I'm writing something new, and like I realized that it keeps on trying to be a noir when it should not. Like when it becomes a noir, the energy just falls out of the pages. And I was like, what the hell is happening here? And I had to realize that there's one character who's really driving this story. And every time it gets away from her, the book like loses all energy. So
yeah, but it's like a helpful sort of
yeah.
column, yeah, like a toolbox tool, sort of, where you kind of can dissect and then diagnose and then redirect.
Yeah, it's like trying to film yourself like lift weights, and you could be like, I thought I was doing this right, but my left arm is all over the goddamn place right there. So
yeah, there you go. Absolutely. I think that kind of, we have a few other questions on writing and sort of your process. So I think we can segue into that. We had a question about what is the most rewarding aspect of being a writer and what has been the most challenging?
the most
rewarding aspect of being a writer is like, and like I find this always happens in the third book, and seeing the characters grow and really surprise you. They start to become real people. This happened in Miracles and happens in Locklands. Like folks always say, like your characters start to like reflect more and think about like their own history and position, and that's because like they are getting older. And I feel like it's basically, like I said, it's like a model or like a simulation. It's a simulation of a life. I feel like I've gotten to experience my 60s and 70s a little bit, or at least sort of get a spy in there to tell me what it feels like to be in that country a little bit. The most frustrating part of being a writer, I don't know. I actually think it's a pretty good deal. Like I get to make shit up and work on weird projects and get paid to do it. I guess the most frustrating part is when like someone says like, why is anybody talking about you? I feel like people should talk about you more. Why hasn't anybody ever read your stuff? And like I'm always like, it sounds like you need to get better friends. They like the idea, it's like, to me, because I think about my stuff all the time, it's having someone like walk up and be like, have you noticed that they got this paper like in the like toilet room, like in the bathroom, that they've got this paper here? I just found out that's 4. And you're like, really? Like you had no idea? You need to get like better like support as a person to like know what that's about.
Yeah, absolutely. I can understand the frustration in that for sure. That sounds, a little ridiculous. But I mean, speaking of, let's see how much time. Yeah, we have okay. Time for a couple more. Let's see. So we've got. This is actually a specific question about Locklands, and so I think if we can try to answer without doing too many spoilers. But Allie asks, are we going to learn even more about Clef's history and background in this third book?
I think a big
Thumbs up on that. That is a huge part of the story. It's
Yeah.
kind of seeing what mistakes were made in the past and how they all got here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to a very satisfying end, I think, when you've been following these characters for so long. Yeah. And then we have, another sort of writing question. What was your path to authorship? How did you know that that was what you wanted to do? And how did you sort of make it your reality?
I was something that I always kind of wanted to do since I was in high school. Like I wrote, like you mentioned, I wrote fan fiction for World of Warcraft 3, not like the online game. No, Warcraft 3, not World of Warcraft 3. I was like, no, I'm getting this wrong. Warcraft 3, like the click and drag, and you got to build little things. This is before it came out, and so like they had a fan thing about the game before it came out, and so it was really easy to take. Like we've been told that there was like a elf race and whatever, to be able to sort of play in this world and make it your own thing. So I wrote that, and people were like, this is really good, and I was really excited. So I thought that maybe I should try and do this for a living. That was something that just kind of floated in the back of my head. And when I got out of college, I was like, I'm just going to keep writing novels until I get one published, and then I'll be a cool writer guy who gets books published. So I wrote 4 novels. And the 4th one got published. That was Mr. Shivers. That is very much me doing my impression of Cormac McCarthy, which I feel like all insufferable young like white men who have too many degrees must write at some point in time. It is somewhat unfortunate that mine got published. And then I just kind of cast around trying to figure out kind of what I wanted to write. And it all won a whole lot of awards, not a whole lot of awards. It won more awards than it should have. It did not sell too well. And that was when I made the pivot towards serial fiction, writing in sexual fantasy. And that has been much more successful because that was the first thing that folks would always ask. Like I would like publish a book and they'd be like, so is this serious? Is it? And like, it was the idea that, it should be. And so finally I was like, the world is asking me to do this. And so I went ahead and did it. And it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. I'm glad that it's been as fun, hopefully as fun for you as it has been for everyone else to read.
Yeah. And it is worth noting that once I made that pivot, I stopped winning awards.
The Divine Cities was nominated for Hugo, right?
Yeah, at the very end, it was up for best series. And then the Vorksorgian saga was up, and everyone was like, well, we ain't winning that one, man. That lady cleans up at the Hugos. I think she has them like on the back of her garage, so that when she's like pulling in, she can see like her headlights and be like, all right, I'm in close enough.
There you go. Fair enough. I feel like kind of the deal with awards sometimes is when you're up against the powerhouses or the favorites, it's just like,
yeah,
it's a sweep, for better or for worse. If you're a fan of the author, it can be great, but it's also kind of like, want to see more people win and like more work get acknowledged. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But say la vie. So we have a question from Kunlu, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but they asked, it might not be necessary, but would you suggest rereading the first 2 books in the series before diving into the finale?
I give them a skim a little bit. I'm going to totally own up to this. I really did think that we wrote this. We put in a little piece at the start of Locklands that says like, hey, here's what's happened so far. And so folks have asked me are you going to have this like brief summary? It's been like, like the skip recap thing. It's sort of like Netflix. And I've been saying yes. Now that I have this thing, it ain't in here. So I'm not sure why that got cut. I swear to God, this is like the COVID break thing where like you're sure that you did something and like time is just a mist.
Mhm.
But yeah, I would give it a skim just to kind of recall how things are going. I believe I do a pretty good job of catching you up on how everything works. Like you could read these as standalones possibly and get like 60 to 70% of what's going on. But yeah, I would give it a skim or two. I wouldn't read the whole things.
For sure, for sure. And we are coming up on our time, but I think that we have an anonymous question that I think is always a great sort of question to end with, which is sort of, can you just tell us about your favorite authors, your favorite books, and what you're reading right now and loving?
I was on a panel actually just this past Sunday for Texas Writers League, and someone asked like a question about like info dumps and like how to, if you have to do them, how do you make them pleasurable? And do you always have to make it like integral to the plot or to the character? Is there a way to have like an info dump that doesn't necessarily do that? And all the panelists were like, "No, I mean, not really." And I was like, "There is." Like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, like the joy of that book is the info dumps that are not pertinent to a damn thing happening in the story. Like, I don't know if like, you can Google this, but it's like a Jane Austen story where like England had magic. Like it's like an alternate like reality, Jane Austen style story, kind of like, or like the era Georgian style story where there was like a medieval king who was a powerful sorcerer who owned most of like Yorkshire for like 300 years. And it's got lots of footnotes that have a great voice, and she figured out a way to write these little tiny short stories that are fragments and pieces of that refer to something much bigger that is so enticing and just get your brain going like crazy. It's like the Chris Van Allsburg book that you read as a kid, where there was like an illustration, a title, and one sentence from it. That's what it is. Each one of these. And so she is sort of the model for taking like an info dump and making like a treasure out of it. And that was actually something that I really want to do in City of Stairs, where I want to do info dumps or like do the footnotes sort of thing. Instead, I went with having each chapter begins with like an epigram that refers to a holy text or a like historical text that refers back to this like unknown history. So that was a huge inspiration for me. What I am reading right now is a complete history of nearly everything by Bill Bryson, which is delightful. It is the most, like, it's really hard to express how the book works. It's like nonfiction. It's all about cosmology and things like that, and like atoms, the birth of the universe, and how the world works. But he does it like, his voice is amazing. That guy could write about pickles, like he could write about the pickle barrels, and I would find it witty and entrancing.
Amazing. Well, those are some great recommendations. Always a lovely note to end on what folks are reading. Maybe that's just the bookseller in me. I always want to know what people are reading. Well, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. We're so excited to have the book out in the world. Very, very great. Happy launch day. And thank you to our audience who had some really wonderful questions. And just were super engaged in the chat. We had a lot of really like lovely little emojis and things, positivity. So if you didn't get a chance to look, there's some nice little fun stuff going on in there. And I did just drop a little message in the chat for folks, but I can drop a link one more time. If you would like a copy of the book that includes a signed bookplate, you have until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. And if you purchase it at this link, your copy of the book will include that signed bookplate. Very exciting. We love signed things. So feel free to check that out. And yeah, thank you again to our audience, to you, Robert. It's been such a wonderful evening. And yeah, really excited for the book to be out. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for spending part of your afternoon or evening with me. And stay safe. Be well.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.